Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. 𝗧, and today in office hours, my colleague, Dr. Jemy Joseph, is joining me from Inuvik, where she is locuming. Jemy's career is quite diverse in scope and geography. She does a blend of emergency medicine and comprehensive family medicine, all the way from Toronto to remote parts of Canada and the Arctic, serving marginalized communities, including First Nations, refugees, immigrants, and BIPOC communities. Jemy also teaches medical students and mentors young physicians. She runs the Canadian Medical Housing Facebook group to help learners find housing during their electives. So in this video, we've come up with our top 5 mistakes to avoid when starting out your career as a new doctor. Being first-generation immigrants ourselves, both of us learned by trial and error. And as teachers, a lot of our students come to us with challenges they faced when starting out their careers. But before we begin, I'm curious, what is it like to practice in Inuvik, and how did you find out about that opportunity?
Thank you, Steph, for having me on this video. I'm very privileged to talk to you during this interview. So in the practice itself in Inuvik is usually typical of a rural family practice where you do a little bit of everything. Typically, doctors who come up here as locum tend to do family clinic, plus or minus ER, plus or minus obstetrics, plus or minus hospitalist. So those are some of the main roles that the hospital up here has. So depending on your area of comfort and specialty, you can sign up for the extent of things you want to do. And typically in rural remote medicine, they do expect you to do some inpatient hospital work in addition to clinic, and that's part of the expectations. I personally do some ER shifts and family clinic while I'm up here. So that's the practice itself. In terms of finding out about this locum specifically, I heard about it through my colleagues, and sometimes it's about the timing working out as well, because I remember wanting to come to Inuvik a few years ago, but pre-COVID, when there was not much doctor shortage, they were very well staffed and they didn't need too many locums at that time. But during the pandemic, there were seasons of short staffing, and that's where I got the opportunity to come up here for the first time a year ago. Absolutely enjoyed it, so I decided to come back again this year. So that's how I found out about this locum specifically.
I see. So it wasn't really like in an ad or something that people can look up. It tends to be more so like word of mouth. Is that right?
Yeah.
And out of curiosity, as since you've done so many different locums, what tends to be the compensation like when you're doing these like northern locums or, locums outside of the Ontario and the Toronto area?
Yeah, so coming back to finding out about locums, unfortunately, there is no centralized database anywhere in this country yet where you can find out about locums that matches your interest. And so a lot of it is about finding out through word of mouth. When you go to conferences related to your specialty, they will have recruiters there usually advertising different positions. The magazines like your specialty magazines like CFPC, CFP, for example, will have ads, but they usually have less uptake compared to talking to colleagues or going to your physician-specific forums like Facebook groups related to your specialty where people talk about it. But I would say the biggest source is probably talking to someone who has been in it, and sometimes your programs may get information about locums that you can ask about as well before you graduate. In terms of compensation, I would define rural remote can be within Ontario itself. Like there are very remote parts in Ontario, and particularly northwestern Ontario. And then there's remote parts like where I am all the way in the Arctic, which was 9 hours of flight time alone to get here over 2 days. So the compensation depends completely based on the province or the territory where you are, because healthcare is territorial and provincial. So I would say that in the context of family clinic, for example, if in an urban family clinic in Toronto, you're able to make $800 to $1,000 a day for an 8-hour workday, here up in Northwest Territories, you could be making anywhere between $1,200 to $1,500 a day. And the more remote a setting is, and the further north or the further more difficult it is to reach there, and the further isolated you are, typically the pay is higher for the same amount of time. But that isn't always true for all specialties. I would say for ER, for example, which I also do in GTA and also here in Inuvik, the hourly rate is probably equal to or probably even less, depending on where in Northwest Territories I am. So some specialties, it might be a pay raise and some might be a pay cut by 10 to 20%. But also that's a reflection of the volume that you're seeing. Like maybe the volume is like 50% less than what you might be seeing in GTA, for example. So the numbers itself doesn't speak volumes without knowing the pay and the time you're putting in, the volume and the time you're putting in as well.
And it also sounds like you get a little bit in terms of like a stipend for living expenses or for your rental, like that you're living in there.
Yeah, so typically what is covered in a locum that is sponsored by the province or territory to cover a community that does not have doctors or need doctors for coverage is flight is covered, and typically they provide some sort of housing. The housing can vary between some hospitals have rental houses in the town that they rent out to physicians, and that's supposed to be furnished. Some will have like residence dorm-like settings where you may have a living quarters for yourself, but for example, the laundry and lounge area might be shared between physicians and other learners, for example. So the housing situation, there is no way to compare because every town comes up with a completely different solution. So the housing is included. That being said, there's no particular living stipend that is given. So meals are not included, and any basic necessities like your toiletries and whatever you need is not included. So typically, that's something to prepare for as you come for locums, depending on how far the community is and what's available there. Like you try to bring up whatever your basic needs are. And, and typically meals tend to be quite expensive the further north you go. We're talking at least double the price of food, especially with inflation. Some communities I've been to, the prices have been 3 to 4 times more than what I would pay in Toronto for meals. So that is an out-of-pocket expense.
And that's really good to know. And it kind of brings me to discussing the first big mistake that new doctors make when starting out in practice, because it sounds to me like you've actually done a lot of locum experience throughout your career. And, that's actually how a lot of new grads start out their careers by locuming. And I found that one of the biggest mistakes is that new doctors will take on too much too early. So for example, you've seen some locum opportunities. It's like 1,500 to 1,800 patient rosters, and they work 3 days a week. And you're a new grad, you don't know the patients, you don't know how much administrative work there is, but you're expected to take on this doctor's full roster. What's kind of your experience with that issue?
Yeah, absolutely true. I think there's a few driving forces here. I mean, when you're looking to the end of residency, you're just waiting for that last day, June 30th, to arrive, and you are ready to dive into the work world because you're probably sick and exhausted of residency. You're sick and exhausted of the very low underpaid work that you've been doing. You may potentially have higher debt loads, which is what our colleagues graduating now are coming out with. So there's a lot of driving forces to just get into the real world staff life. And unfortunately, too many people indeed commit too much upfront. First mistake I would say is just to not give yourself a break or a breathing room. You owe it to yourself after putting 10 to 15 years straight, usually in post-secondary education with really very little breaks, and your body, mind, and soul have been stretched. So some people start working July 1st itself without giving themselves a day off, which is a huge disgrace if you haven't built in some recovery time, particularly in your first year. Secondly, I think people might mimic their staff, which is usually a role models, and go, you know what, my staff runs a practice of 2,000, I'll be able to do it, without realizing that the training wheels are completely coming off. And you might, if you're picking a setting that is new to you, you don't know the patients, you don't know what kind of support systems you have. You may not have admin, you may not have nursing, you may not have adequate specialty supports where you are. So each patient is going to be taking up a lot more time than your staff might have to do. So yeah, people tend to sign up without realizing the gravity of the work they're taking on, and also without realizing whether they're fairly compensated for the volume of work that they're doing, paid and unpaid. So very big mistake, setting people up for failure and burnout quickly. In fact, from a demographic perspective, the number one demographic that is burned out is younger physicians within first 5 to 10 years of practice, and mostly females. So, which is quite distressing given already the shortages that we have in our system. And if we're not addressing this issue early on, it can lead to significant physician workforce crisis down the road.
Yeah, and I remember I graduated during COVID, and so I was working 6 days a week when I first graduated. And I think like kind of my advice to new grads is it's hard to start out with so many days, because when you start cutting down your clinic days, patients get upset like, oh, why is the doctor not being available anymore? I feel like if I were to start again, I'd probably start at like 3 days a week. And then if I feel like I could add more to it, then I would add a maybe fourth day, maybe not a fifth day, but I think I would have done something like that instead when it comes to dealing with the big workload starting out.
Yeah. And then also the transition from being an employee to self-employed is also underestimated. You need extra time to finally do your own accounting, do your own billing, to figure out the logistics of finances, the logistics of living, the logistics of work life, all the paperwork that comes through. Like there's not enough time allocated for the professional logistics and not just the clinical practice. I personally graduated, took a month off, went on a nice vacation, which I understand during COVID, a lot of people didn't have the luxury of doing. And then I started practicing doing locum work in my second month.
And do you have any advice for new grads starting locums to know how, like whether a locum is considered predatory, like it's taking advantage of the new grad versus not?
I would say in general, locum is a good way to get your feet wet without having the burden of running a business, which is what clinical practices are in real life as a staff. So that it's a good way to transition into your career. That being said, there's a lot of unknowns and things that are not taught about the practice of medicine for when you graduate. So how to read a contract. Does the pay make sense for the amount of work you're asked to do? What kind of coverage are you providing that is paid for and outside of what's paid for, and how much unpaid work is involved? What kind of supports are involved? And if you have any questions about the practice, or if you're running into roadblocks, who do you talk to? Because you no longer have a supervisor like you did in residency, or a team of colleagues like in your residency peer group. So there's a lot of questions to ask. And in fact, I actually worked with the Ontario Medical Association on a locum working group committee just to help locums transition better. So we have prepared some resources on the kind of questions to ask as a locum. It is on the OMA website for anyone interested. But
that's good to know. I'll download that and I'll try to put it in the description of the video as well.
It's a lot of us who went through that lived experience and, gathered up all the things that we wish we knew when we started off, because sometimes you just dive right in and you make a lot of mistakes. And yes, you are such an easy prey. Typically, doctors tend to be givers and very generous. So a combination of a generous spirit with no employment business skills, with very fresh and keen to work, makes you the ideal candidate to be taken advantage of by some employers or business owners. So you really want to make sure that, locuming is good, but you're not being predated upon exactly as you said. So it does involve a lot of knowing what the baseline is, what to expect, and the right questions to ask, and getting clarity before signing contracts.
Yeah. And one of the big questions I think new grads should ask is what happens to the lab results, to the EMR, when you are no longer a locum? Because technically you're still responsible for the labs you ordered, but if you're no longer a locum there, you don't have access to the EMRs. So what is the legal responsibility? So when it comes to looking at contracts for locums, make sure that in the contract it says that the labs, the referrals, and all the testing and things like that is the responsibility of the host rather than on you, because you wouldn't be able to access it when you're out of the locum.
Exactly. Yeah, these are logistical details you're not thinking when you're diving into work. And usually you figure out on the go or when you're exiting, and then you're like, oh no, I did not get this in writing, or we don't have a plan around it. So you might run into trouble later on. So the more upfront work and research you can do and get the contract ready and right, the less heartache you're taking on later in terms of practice stressors.
Yeah, and that kind of brings us to our second mistake. Do you want to talk about the second big mistake new grads make?
Yeah, so typically, people tend to sign up for, again, that keenness and the debt load tends to drive people to sign up for jobs that are quite unmanageable. So taking on practices that are very large volumes and over a shorter period of time. Especially if you're taking over practices where the physician is retiring, the medical world has changed completely from where medicine was 50 years ago, let alone 30 years ago, let alone 10 years ago to today. So taking on a practice where somebody built it up over years and is giving it to you overnight means you don't know the patients, you don't know their complications, you don't know all the hidden communications and the things that a previous physician may know about that patient cognitively without actually documenting it. So you may need double the time with the patient than the person you're taking it over from or covering for. So not actually adequately giving yourself grace room to deal with the practice means you're going to burn out very quickly and get overwhelmed very quickly. So if a physician you're taking over from or covering from is doing a roster of 2,000 over 3.5 days, you may need 5.5 days to do the same kind of practice. So again, taking away less rest time and break for yourself. And this is not accounting for the paperwork involved as well, which requires scheduled admin time to catch up on. So I see this quite common, and then physicians are overwhelmed, and next thing they know, they're thinking of how to get out of the setting. So that also doesn't do yourself a favor and your patient population when you're feeling that overwhelmed and burnt out so early on.
Yeah, so essentially what you're saying is like, locuming, it's temporary. If you don't like it and things go wrong and you can't manage it, at least it'll be for a certain number of months. But there are some people who will sign on to permanent contracts, right? Or take on permanent rosters, because once a patient is rostered to you, you are their doctor. It's really hard to let go of them, especially if you realize that, okay, well, I'm not going to be living in this area. Me and my family are going to move to a different area, and it's much harder to take that roster with you, right?
Yeah. And also even just the administrative burden of signing on patients to your practice. And then if you're leaving, it's a whole another 6-month process just to sign off on the practice. So it is just relieving you with just a heavy administrative burden that, is essentially unpaid time during that process as well. So you're really doing yourself a huge disfavor by signing on to permanent high volume jobs instead of locuming first, seeing if you like it, and then decide how much to take on with time as you have more experience under your belt.
So let's talk about some advice when it comes to these permanent job contracts. So I would probably say one of the biggest advice is if you're a member of the Ontario Medical Association or any provincial medical association, paying the membership dues allow you to get access to their employment lawyers, and they can review contracts for you, whether it be locum or permanent contracts, especially for permanent contracts, to make sure you're signing on to the right thing. Because once you sign a contract, it's binding and it is permanent. Do you have any other suggestions around that, Jemy?
Yeah, I mean, OMA is a great resource, or your provincial association may have employment lawyers. In some organizations, they will not review a contract between two doctors because it might be a conflict to support both sides. So it is totally worth it to hire an employment lawyer for a couple of hours to take a look over to make sure that you're legally protected. Sometimes we forget that medicine is equally medical and equally a business that you're running. And it's a mind frame shift that needs to happen when you're coming out of residency to staff life. I would say even backtracking one step, read the contract. I think historically people just tend to sign any papers put in front of them with a smile without knowing what the 16-page document says. So even just reading your own contract, you might start picking up, your spidey senses might go up saying this line doesn't make sense or that doesn't make sense. So reading the contract and asking questions is step one to know that you're getting a fair deal in the process. Because again, the legal cost to break a contract is going to be much higher than paying somebody a bit of money now to read it and making sure it's what you want when you sign up for a practice.
And especially for academic locations, sometimes the contract can be very strict, right? And it can have certain clauses in the contract that may not be really beneficial to you, but because it's like an academic site, a lot of people maybe in specialties want to sign it, right? Because it's hard to find jobs for certain specialties. So if you have some mentors, especially in the academic setting, or even on certain Facebook groups like the Physicians Financial Independence Facebook group, or even the what was it called, the First 5 Years in Family Medicine. There's an Ontario one and a Canada one. they have people who work in a variety of settings from academic to community. And I've seen people post like jobs that they're considering on there, and people will comment like, hey, this part is not that favorable to you. It might be, taking advantage of your time, or not compensating you well enough as well.
And also I say, you know what, just as much as you want a good entry plan and a solid plan, you want to think about a good exit plan as well. Again, nobody's, it's like a divorce. Nobody's marrying, thinking a divorce is going to happen, but you got to plan for all scenarios just to protect yourself in the contracts.
Exactly. And this doesn't apply to job contracts either. Like if you're a new physician starting an office, rental contracts apply as well, right? And you want a lawyer to read through that too, because a rental contract for like a commercial property, like a clinic, is different than your rental contract with like a condo or an apartment landlord. Those contracts tend to be like 10 years long. So once you sign that contract to have your clinic in this office building, you're signing it for a very long time, such that if you were to take maternity leave or you were to go on sabbatical or for whatever reason, it's very hard to break a binding contract like that. And you're on the hook for the rent.
Yeah, and whether you have adequate insurances to protect yourself in those unexpected scenarios as well. Something that, again, you don't think about upfront, but necessary to consider.
Exactly. And overhead insurance is not that expensive. It's about like $5 something a month, right? So it's not too bad. Okay, so that brings me to mistake number 3, which is, new grads are susceptible to medical legal issues. And I was actually at a panel discussion about college complaints and what to do if you get one. And I'll link that recording of that panel discussion above and in the description below as well. And a panelist had said you can expect to get 1 patient complaint every 7 years. And new grads are very susceptible to getting a college complaint, because when you are a resident, you often have a staff physician to review with and to check over your stuff. But you don't really think about, how you're going to protect yourself. So now that you're on your own, that's something that you now have to think about, but not a lot of new grads think about it. Yeah. So I'm kind of curious, Jemy, have you ever gotten any college complaints or complaints in your early practice?
Yeah, thankfully, no college complaints, though that fear is always there, particularly when I do emergency medicine, which is, I would say, a medical legally very high risk environment, because I'm dealing with patients I've never met before. They come in usually in some sort of crisis, and I have a very short period of time to see them, address a crisis, and there's always a chance that I might miss something in that process, especially in high volume settings. And with the current Canadian healthcare crisis with overcrowded ERs, not enough resources, not enough staffing, the chances of mistakes tend to go up. I've had 2 smaller complaints come through the hospital, patient complaints. And in both the cases, they were thankfully resolved quite quickly because my documentation, I would say, saved me. I would say when you're a resident, there's someone always looking over you. And also you're graded in terms of your kind of end of your residency part. So people are more cognizant of what they write and doing good medicine. One of the mistakes I find is people, when they enter staff life, the keenness plus wanting to be like a staff and wanting to work like their supervisors in residency, people tend to go faster and may start to take shortcuts. And both of those things are quite deadly to resulting in you making higher mistakes. I always tell doctors, safe practice first. Start safely, and as you build experience and confidence, yes, you will know for yourself where you can go faster or where are things where you can eliminate inefficiencies to improve speed, but it shouldn't come at the risk of compromising clinical care, because that is what's going to get you into trouble. So rushing and taking shortcuts and all that, be mindful of it. Some people tend to do it just as part of the transition, but it's not worth the risk to go through. And in my case, my documentation of what I did was so thorough that my chief said, nothing here to worry about. This doctor did what was their due diligence. And that is what you want to provide standard of care and maintain due diligence in your practice.
Yeah, and I completely agree. And I can share an experience because I actually have gotten a college complaint when I was in first year of residency. So I probably felt like the most incompetent resident ever, because imagine you're just in your first year and you get a college complaint. And documentation was actually was on my side, because in that particular situation, we try to follow these guidelines. And unfortunately, I think after reviewing with the staff and talking to the patient felt that we weren't doing enough, right? We weren't ordering the tests that they wanted, doing the imaging that they wanted. But because I documented in my notes that these were the guidelines that I was following when it comes to the examination, like if they met these criteria, then we wouldn't do imaging. If they did meet the criteria, then we would. And so I guess they weren't happy with that answer. And so they ended up filing a college complaint against me, but not my staff, because I think my staff wasn't there in the room. And I was just walking out of the room to talk with them. So the patient didn't actually know who the staff physician was. So they just knew me. And then that's how I ended up getting a college complaint. And what happens when you get a college complaint for, I guess, new grads is that you would get this anonymous message, or this message saying you have to check this portal for another message. And it would come from the CPSO. So you're like, what is this? This is very strange. And then you go into this portal and then it'll say what the complaint was about. And it's like this anonymous portal system. And then afterwards, it will tell you what was the reason why you got this complaint and what did the patient write about you and things like that. And then, so what I did was I called the CMPA, the Canadian Medical Protective Association, and they provided me with a lot of advice on how to write a letter in return to kind of explain what happened in the situation. They also got my notes as well. So they saw all of my documentation, which was very comprehensive because I was a first-year resident at the time. And in the end, the complaint was thrown out. But it is a lot of stress, and I can understand for a lot of new grads, it's quite a lot of stress. And even in my family practice, there are some people who joined on, they were just in their first year and they've gotten college complaints too, often around like not providing a certain test because it might not be in the choosing wisely guidelines, or not providing a certain letter for something. And then the patient, I guess, didn't like what they hear. So there are certain situations like that where you can get a college complaint, and it does cause a lot of new grads a lot of stress because it is over several months. It's a very long, drawn out process. And then in my case, I had to tell my program director about it. So I feel like it was not so good of an image to, it's not a good look, essentially. And I actually felt that something that helped alleviate my stress was I was in the residence lounge, and I was just saying to the residents, hey, has anyone ever gotten a college complaint before? I didn't disclose anything, I didn't break any confidentiality, but I just asked that question. And then somebody else had said they had also gotten a college complaint as a resident, and they were working in the emerge, and the patient just named the whole circle of care in their complaint, and they happened to be in there as well. And so it caused them a lot of stress. And I feel like when this does happen to you, definitely reach out to people who are your mentors, reach out to your colleagues, because chances are most physicians have experienced this once in their life. And it's not something that's very uncommon. It's not something to be ashamed of either. And it just teaches you, at least it taught me early on, how to best protect myself. So that's why whenever I write notes, I use templates. And the templates are very comprehensive. It even includes like the red flags. And even if I forget to tell the patient about it in the moment, when I put on the template, I see it says here red flag. So it just triggers my memory while I'm there with the patient as to what to talk to the patient about as well. So that's kind of like, my experience. And, even when you're a new grad, sometimes you'll be pushed when it comes to your boundaries, like especially if you're locuming. Patients might ask you to prescribe certain opioids or benzos that you may not be comfortable prescribing, but you feel like you have to do it because maybe the original doctor did it. And sometimes in those sticky situations, it might make you, it might be medically legally challenging case because, you might be prescribing something that might not be safe to the patient, but the previous doctor did. And now the patient is asking you to continue, right? So what I found really helpful in cases of like opioids, mental health, benzos, like those type of cases, was joining the peer learner program from the Ontario College of Family Physicians. So I actually got paired with some like the chief of the pain program at a hospital. And I was like a first year new grad. And whenever I had questions about fibromyalgia or chronic pain and high opioid prescribing, I actually asked them and I discussed with them. And they told me, oh, don't forget to put in like a opioid contract to protect yourself. Don't forget to do regular urine drug screens. So things like that, it's kind of like having a staff physician as a staff physician. So that I would say is like a piece of advice I would give to the listeners on this video.
Yeah, and it's also another mindset shift because you're used to being told what to do, or you have to follow somebody else's way of doing things when you're a resident, and now you're completely independent and you owe it to yourself to protect your license. So kind of building up that guts to set the boundaries for yourself and saying, this is where I draw the line. This is my standard of, this is the standard of care I'm providing, and this is due diligence, and really sticking to it and not be a pushover, which can, again, happen in that early stages because you have been pushed over for many years. So that's another mindset shift you need to mentally prepare yourself for and practice
exactly. Yeah, setting your own boundaries is very important. And the earlier you set boundaries with patients, you'll find that, patients will treat you more with respect. I've also had to set boundaries with patients where they have said certain things to front desk staff that weren't that polite. And, the earlier you set it, the less likely it will escalate to more, threatening behavior, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
So do you want to talk about the fourth mistake regarding compensation and money management?
Yeah. So in residency, you are underpaid. That's just nationally how it's done, which is unfortunate. You're definitely undervalued for your work. So when people come into staff life, seeing a bigger check really just, I kind of think of it as if you watched Aladdin, the monkey in the cave, when he sees this shiny red object, the eyes pop out. That's kind of what happens when you become a staff. You see the bigger dollars, and you're like, oh, that sounds amazing, without actually taking a step back and evaluating, okay, this clinic or this job is offering me this much. Does it make sense for the work that is being done, for the context in which it's being done, and for the volume and acuity that I'm seeing? So very rarely, people do that, and they tend to, again, just accept whatever money is offered to them. As an example, $500 for a half day of family clinic where the practice size is 800 patients versus $500 for half day of family clinic for a practice size of 2,000 is completely different. It's the same number and looks good on paper compared to what you made in residency, but you'll be working 4 times harder in the second scenario to earn the same kill. And is that amount of money fair for that patient population? So that's not talked about enough. So one is in terms of the direct clinical compensation for the work that you're doing. Secondly, overhead and any associated expenses that come with the practice, especially if you're in an out-of-hospital practice. There might be additional expenses to running the clinic and the business side of things itself. Is that being well negotiated? And finally, again, this is something now we talk about more because we have groups like Physician Financial Independence and many other Facebook groups where you can ask questions that I didn't have access to 6 years ago when I graduated, to see, is this a fair deal? Because we don't have any standardized numbers stuck on a piece of wall for us to compare to know if we're getting a fair deal. So really knowing what you're worth for your specialty, your location, your volume, and negotiating is something that we are not prepared for, but that is a super essential skill to make sure you're not leaving money on the table.
Exactly. And what are your thoughts about, like, what if you aren't really in a position to negotiate? Because let's say you graduated in a career where there aren't very many jobs. So, or you're just limited to where you have to work. How would you kind of negotiate compensation or your work around that?
Yeah, so first of all, again, I would say it might take talking to a lot of your seniors, especially as you go through the residency journeys. You can talk to your senior residents or fellows and even the staff you work with. First of all, that's what you can do ahead of time while you're a resident to know what is the going rates for that profession, for that setting, because academic pays, for example, very different than community. Now, some places will say this is the only job in the country you can get. And unfortunately, there are subspecialties where there's very few jobs. So you may not have, for example, negotiating room in the pay, for example, but are there other things that you may want in a contract that's available? For example, having a protected day off for admin and paperwork. Your teaching time is protected so that it's not interfering with your clinical schedule. If you had to take a leave of absence, maternity leave, or sabbatical, what does that look like? Is that protected, and is that paid, for example? So there are other areas of negotiation that could come in that is contributing to yourself, maybe not directly financially, because that might be fixed, but that might be contributing positively to your mental health and well-being, to your family life, to your personal life, to make sure you have a balance so that your career is sustainable in the long run.
Exactly. And we always talk about when it comes to negotiations, it's not just about the income, but also about the protected time, the administrative time that you mentioned as well. And while we're on the topic of compensation, do you want to touch on who should be on your team, your financial team, now that you're making staff salary?
Yeah. So, in some ways I miss the residency life where I just get a paycheck every 2 weeks and I know exactly what I have to live off of. The part of the big transition to staff life is that mindset shift from being an employee to self-employed, and you're your own employer essentially. You are a high earning professional, and you got to have the right team around you to set yourself up for success. And some of the most important players that is going to be part of setting yourself up for success is going to be finding the right accountant. Do your research. Don't let anyone say, oh yeah, these people are great, just go with them. Ask the questions that make sense for your life circumstances to see if this accountant is the right fit for you. You may or may not need a lawyer, depending on what kind of contracts you're signing, to review your contracts. Employment lawyers, maybe again, lawyers that do real estate, for example, if you're engaging more real estate as part of your practice. I would say, though, there are professionals that we can think of that are more formal, but to me, your team is also the informal people that are part of building your success. These could be mentors, these could be coaches, these could be resources you're accessing upfront to make sure that you're setting yourself up for success. Like Steph said about the peer learning program, there's people you can access. Are you part of appropriate forums where you can ask questions? Do you have people that you consider safe to talk about, if you run into distressing situations, both clinically or medical legally? So those are all, again, that might be more informal people in your life that may not have formal titles, but they are just as necessary to have to ensure your success. So one of the things I did was I had a little WhatsApp group with really close friends, a couple of them, just 3 of us in a team, where we could talk about general vent of the profession and say, you know what, this happened to me today, didn't make me feel good. Could I have done something different? Then I have another little peer group that I can talk about in the case of emergency medicine, specific clinical scenarios that I feel like I needed to brush up on, or could I have done more? Some more clinical conversations happening there, and they're giving me feedback on what could I have done different or better, or how to handle it differently in the future. So there are these little teams that you can set up that is protecting you from many different directions. And I would even say taking care of your own mental and emotional well-being, for example. Who are the people you can talk to? It could be informal friends, mentors, but it could also be formal people like psychotherapists or psychologists that are just being part of your cheerleading team, I call it. So build your team up early on so that you have a team carrying you through and you're not walking this journey alone. It is not an easy journey, and you're going to need all the supports you can get.
Yeah, and that's super important. And the other person I would just add is maybe like a fee-for-service financial planner as well, because a lot of times now that you have all this income, you might have certain goals, right? Like you might be saving up money to have a child, or to buy a house, or to just even get started in the investing journey. And a lot of people, they will graduate and they don't know what to invest in, or how they should invest. So that's where maybe having a planner can kind of project, okay, you need this money in 5 years. This is how your investing strategy should be as well.
And a big strategy also, you may have alluded to this debt payment, which is something that almost every new grad needs to think about as part of their financial strategy going forward.
Exactly. And making sure to prioritize paying off that debt, because we all graduate with quite a lot of debt as well.
Yes.
And so I guess this brings me to my fifth biggest mistakes is knowing when to leave a toxic environment, because often new grads, maybe they sign on to like a contract or something and they end up staying for years. Sometimes they might even end up perpetuating the toxicity themselves in that environment. So I think, maybe as med students and residents, we tend to get used to workplace toxicity or hierarchical systems and the idea that like the most junior person gets all the scut work. But that work culture doesn't always have to be the case. Have you ever had any interactions or experiences with these kind of environments?
Taking a deep breath here because I learned a lot of mistakes the hard way, and I've definitely experienced, unfortunately, multiple toxic work environments early in my career. I would say that there is a bit of Stockholm syndrome that we carry with us to survive medical school and residency, very intense, hard, torturous years. And sometimes that mindset carries into the staff life. So if we were treated not so well as a resident and medical student, we somehow accept that as a baseline way of being treated into staff life. And really, you may need to get a team of people around you to even point things out to say, that's not acceptable, how they talk to you, how they treated you, how they handle your case. So yes, I've experienced environment where I was financially taken advantage of, where they underpaid me, and then I had to fight months to get paid my fair wages. I have experienced racism in medicine. I've experienced sexism in medicine, and I had to learn the hard way because being the goody two-shoe, polite person that I was, I tolerated a lot more things that today I would not tolerate. And I wish, back then I had more people tell me to call it out or to walk away from certain situations. There were clinics and clinical settings that I walked away from, and sometimes it took me a few months to build up the courage to say, I'm not coming back to this setting because I'm not treated well. So if you're having that inkling, even that inkling saying something feels off, listen to your gut instinct and talk to people about it. Because again, you're not used to standing up for yourself and speaking up, or even learning to walk away. Those are actually skills you need to practice and have sometimes people in your corner to help you do that. I mean, step one is just recognizing it before you're going to decide what you're going to do about it. But know that as a self-employed staff professional, you do not have to tolerate discrimination and toxicity the way maybe you may have tolerated it for many years in your life before that.
Exactly. And that's a good point. I remember when I was in residency, I got punched in the chest by a patient, and then I told the staff physician about it. But then when we both went in to talk to the patient was actually extremely polite to the staff physician. And I was like, wait, what happened? Like, they were so mean to me. And then suddenly they just changed to be very polite. And then I realized, when you're a resident, it might be harder for you to stand up for yourself because you're not the MRP, you're not the staff physician. It's much tougher for you to just say, like, call it out in front of the patient. But then I think now when you are a staff physician, you've already graduated, it's really good to set that example of calling out microaggressions, calling out racism. And the more you do it early, the less it will get worse and worse. Because I find that in any situation, if you've ever experienced microaggressions or racism, in the beginning, it might just seem like a very benign comment, right? It's just something you brush off, but then it might escalate to more and more until maybe in the end, it damages a relationship between you and an employer or you and a patient. And maybe it might even end up leading to a college complaint, for instance. So that's why I always say, call it out early. Sorry, go ahead.
And even with burnout, right, you're internally being demoralized. And the other thing is you're not used to valuing yourself as a resident. And you're overworked and underpaid. So suddenly now you're in an environment where you can get paid fair rates and you don't need to tolerate bullying. So just make sure that your emotional, physical, and mental well-being is protected. You can only guarantee your safety first and foremost for yourself, and nobody else can do that for you. And it might seem like as self-employed professionals, we may not have too many labor laws in our favor, but there are laws in this country. This is Canada. There are laws to protect our workers, and that includes doctors. And instead of saying, oh, we have to get used to it, no, your safety comes first. If anyone is physically assaulting you, you have every right to call the police and complain about safety, for example, and not just say, oh, that they were just having a bad day. You should protect yourself. And that's something that you have to teach yourself to do.
Exactly. And so just to kind of summarize the 5 top mistakes that we've come up with. Number 1, taking on more than you can handle. Number 2, signing a binding contract too early. Number 3, not being aware of potential medical legal issues and how to protect yourself. Number 4, not negotiating your income and building a solid financial foundation. And number 5, staying in a toxic work environment. So that brings us to the end. And this also brings us to the 5 rapid fire questions that I ask everyone that comes on to office hours. So my first question for you, Jemy, is what is your best investment?
Does it have to be financial?
Nope, anything.
Into my mental health, actually seeing a psychologist and the therapist when needed. I think being emotionally and mentally strong has allowed me to stay stable through many of the chaotic times in healthcare that we've been through in recent years.
Okay, and number 2, what is your worst investment?
Financially starting too late because I was scared and didn't know about money. So once my debts were paid off, I just had money sitting in my bank account with doing nothing to it for a couple of years.
Good one. Number 3, what is a charitable cause that you're passionate about?
Yeah, I think I'm very passionate about and quite involved with organizations that empower women, particularly marginalized populations, so first-generation immigrant refugees. So more recently, I joined the board of an organization called Women Helping Empower Women, especially focused again on this group and promoting events for helping them. And globally, I grew up in India, and there's a charity called Reaching with Compassion that I am on the board of and support through mission work there as well. And really, a lot of the focus is the marginalized population with the indigenous community in India.
That's amazing. Sounds like a really good charitable cause. And number 5, what is your favorite locum destination?
Tough one to pick. I'm just going to keep it generic and say I love Northwest Territories. I have found this territory to be absolutely beautiful. I've been to about 7 or 8 communities here, and generally a lot of them end up feeling like family. So I just feel like I'm coming from one home to another, which also makes the transition easier into the clinical environment. And the people are just so nice. And particularly, again, I love working with the First Nations populations, which is majority of the patients here. And just the niceness just makes it just such a rewarding environment to work in. And I see the fruit of the labor, so to speak, even though it's such a long journey to come here and settle down and get adjusted. I find that when I start the work, I can see the impact more clearly here.
Cool. I realize I said number 5 for the previous question, but actually that was number 4. So number 5 is, if you didn't pursue medicine, what career would you have gone into?
A good one. I think I would have been a travel journalist, and I consider myself the female Anthony Bourdain.
Oh, nice.
There's just a piece of me that's Dora the Explorer, which is what people call me when they see me at travel shows. And I've been to 39 countries on 6 continents. And I just love getting to know people, cultures, arts, food, and just celebrating humanity. And I think traveling and that journalism bit could be combined into another career that I could have been.
That sounds really amazing, actually. So thank you for joining me on today's episode of Office Hours. If students or residents want to reach out to you to ask about like locum advice and things like that, what's the best way that they can reach you?
Yeah, so you can find me at my website, which is www.jemyjoseph.com, spelled as my name, JemyJoseph.com. I'm also on LinkedIn under the same name, and my Instagram name, maybe Steph can tag it, is Sojourning MD, which was more a reference to being a travel doctor when I first created that account. SOJOURNING MD is my Instagram as well. So yeah, I'm on all social media forums, and you'll find me in many of the Facebook groups as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Jemy.